Welcome friends, enemies, and everyone in between to my channel, The Masked Mormon. I am in fact the Masked Mormon.
Why are you wearing a mask? Were you burned by acid or something like that?
Oh no, it's just they're terribly comfortable. I think everyone will be wearing them in the future.
If you are returning, welcome back. But if this is your first time here, I am a Mormon who used to believe in the truth claims of the Mormon Church. I did it all. I was baptized, went on a mission, went to BYU, temple marriage, and all the rest of it. I truly believed in the claims of Mormonism. Now, I explore some of the implications of Mormon theology, culture, and some of my own personal experiences, and talk about it on the internet with you fine viewers. If you haven't already, and if you like what I do, please like and subscribe. When someone says Mormon or Mormonism, what is the first word that generally comes to mind? Seeing as how you likely saw the title of this video or the thumbnail, you know that word is, of course, polygamy. When I was on my mission, I was often asked how many wives I had. At the time, I had 0. And if you watched my last video, you know that now I have only 1. Polygamy and Mormonism go together like, I don't know, salt and pepper, mac and cheese, Mickey and Minnie and Minnie and Minnie, Ken and Barbie and Stacy and Chelsea. Despite all of the church's efforts to distance itself from the practice, it is one of the things that it is most well known for. Many others have discussed the history of polygamy in Mormonism much better than I can. Specifically, LDS Discussions has several fantastic essays on the subject that go into a great deal of detail. I will leave a link to the essays in the description. The history of Mormon polygamy is so expansive that it would be hard to do an analysis of it any justice in the format that I generally cover in my videos, especially since it affected so many people over such a long time. There are some great sources that you can look into for a more in-depth treatment of the subject. Todd Compton wrote the book In Sacred Loneliness, The Plural Wives of Joseph Smith, which dives into the lives of the 33 women that are known to have been married to Joseph Smith during the Nauvoo years. He draws from diaries, letters, and other primary and secondary sources. Carolyn Pearson also wrote the book The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy, Haunting the Hearts and Heaven of Mormon Women and Men. She explores not only the historical effects of polygamy, but how it affects members even now. Drawn from thousands of stories that came to the author, she explores how plural marriage still harms marriages and brings chaos to family relationships. So no, I won't be going into great depth on the history of polygamy, just to say that plural marriage was practiced in the church from 1831 until about 1904-ish, when under pressure from the U.S. government, the church discontinued the practice after kind of pretending to discontinue it. And they issued a second manifesto, finally halting the practice. Many generational Mormons trace their ancestry through polygamous family lines. Many people owe their existence to the practice of polygamy. For example, a person might say that they came from, I don't know, the 5th wife of insert prominent church leader. So there can be some kind of nuanced views of the practice throughout the church. It did ruin individual lives of both men and women. Some people loved the practice. Others loathed it. It was rife with unethical behavior that might be considered human trafficking today. It commoditized and objectified women, but many felt it was a sacred religious practice, as important as any other sacrament or tradition in any number of other religions. It often makes members uncomfortable today, something they don't like to think about. Other times, I've heard members, including women, wish for the time that polygamy comes back. Granted, the people I have heard this from, I think it might be more of an indicator of a strained marriage. So no, not so much history, but when I was cruising around Reddit, I saw a thread asking, do we believe in polygamy or not? The general consensus was that yes, the modern church believes in polygamy. Though a man can only have one living wife at a time in the modern church, it still definitely behaves as though polygamy is still a thing. Why do I say this? Because a man can be sealed to more than one woman. If his wife dies, he can marry another woman in the temple, and in the eyes of the church, both women are his wives. The president of the church, Russell Nelson, and the number 2 in charge, Dallin Oaks, are each sealed to 2 women. Their first wives died, and they were later married to a second wife. The converse is not true, however. If a wife outlives her husband, she cannot be sealed to another man without first having her sealing broken, which has a lot of implications in the believed afterlife. They could get married for this life only, and the belief goes that when they die, they are no longer married and they go on to be with the spouse they were originally sealed to. This was actually the case with my first mission president. They had both lost an earlier spouse, and so were married to each other for time only. They were essentially just temporary companions that understood that they would be together temporarily. I remember thinking, even as a believing member, that this seemed kind of sad. But I digress. There were many responses on this Reddit thread from faithful members trying to defend and justify the practice, including whether it will be practiced in the hereafter. So, I thought I would address some of the common defenses and apologetics that believing members will give to polygamy. Now, one of the first things a believing member may bring up is that polygamy was commanded in the Bible, that God told Abraham, Isaac, and other patriarchs to live it. This is one of the opening verses of Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, the section of the Doctrine and Covenants that lays out how polygamy was apparently supposed to be practiced. But Joseph and other leaders never practiced it this way. The problem is, if you actually read the Genesis accounts of these men taking other wives, God is not telling them to do it. For example, Abraham, then called Abram, and his wife Sarai, Sarah, were famously childless. Sarah tells her husband to sleep with her slave girl, Hagar. This occurs in Genesis chapter 16. Hagar gets pregnant. Sarah becomes very jealous and blames her husband. But Abraham tells Sarah that Hagar is hers to do with as she pleases. So Sarah mistreats her and Hagar eventually runs away. An angel appears to Hagar telling her to return to this terrible, terrible family. There she has a son whom Abraham names Ishmael. Sarah eventually becomes pregnant with Isaac, and because Isaac is seen as a more legitimate son, Hagar and Ishmael are driven away into the wilderness. The point being is that no, God did not give this slave girl to Abraham as a wife. This story does raise some pretty big consent issues. But no, Hagar was not a God-given wife. Isaac, Abraham and Sarah's son, had only one wife, which was a little unusual at the time. Polygamy was a thing not because God commanded it, but because it was a cultural tradition. Jacob, on the other hand, had 2 wives, the daughters of Laban. No, a different Laban. He was tricked into marrying Leah, the oldest daughter, by working for her father. Jacob worked for 7 years for the younger daughter, but Laban tricked Jacob. He thought that it was improper for the younger daughter to get married before the older daughter. So, after that 7 years, Jacob was forced to marry Leah, the older daughter. After this, Jacob worked for 7 more years in order to marry Rebekah. In addition to his 2 wives, Jacob also had 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah. That really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Through these 4 women, Jacob had 12 sons, who became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Later, Moses had at least 1 wife, but in Numbers chapter 12, verse 1, it refers to his marriage to a Cushite woman, so he might have had 2 wives. Now, David had at least 8 named wives, but there are suggestions that he had other wives and concubines, including Saul's wives. And his son, Solomon, famously is said to have had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Whoa, now that guy could really get around. But the point is that having multiple wives was a cultural thing, not a God-sanctioned one. Joseph Smith reads the Old Testament and sees polygamy, and despite having writings denouncing it in the Book of Mormon and in the original Doctrine and Covenants, either assumes that this is a practice that needed to come back, or saw all the attractive women and being a powerful and influential man, allows his weaknesses to get the best of him, and he justifies marrying more than 1 wife. He does have a history of philandering with his 17 or 18-year-old live-in maid, Fanny Alger, though this is later revised to try to claim that he received the revelation to begin the practice of plural marriage before his dirty, nasty, filthy affair with Fanny. Another claim is to try to deny that there was ever a sexual component to Joseph's practice of plural marriage. This is patently false. In the 1890s, there was a legal dispute between 2 break-off groups of Mormonism, the RLDS and the Church of Christ, over the ownership of a parcel of land that was dedicated to the building of a temple in Missouri by Joseph Smith. The LDS Church assisted the Church of Christ in order to counteract the RLDS claims of succession after Joseph Smith died. The RLDS Church claimed that Joseph never practiced polygamy. The LDS Church, on the other hand, had several women testify that they were married to Joseph with a sexual component. 19-year-old Emily Partridge, under oath in a deposition of this case, was asked, "Do you make the declaration that you ever slept with Joseph Smith in the same bed?" To which she answered, "Yes, sir." 17-year-old Lucy Walker said that she lived with Joseph Smith as a wife. 19-year-old Melissa Lott said that she was the prophet's wife in very deed. In addition to these women, there are 10 other women where there is strong evidence that Joseph had sex with them. The ages of these 10 girls and women range from 16 to 38. The evidence isn't as clear for the other 25-ish wives, but at this point, does it really matter? The age ranges of these other wives range from just 14 for Helen Mar Kimball and 16 for Flora Ann Woodworth, all the way up into the upper 50s for Rhoda Richards. Some of these people were children. Others were already married to other men. In fact, it wasn't unusual for Joseph to send men on missions to gain access to their wives and daughters. The obvious follow-up question that comes is that if Joseph was sexual with all these women and girls, where are the children? Joseph and Emma, his first wife, were extremely virile and fertile. So what gives? There is little, if any, evidence that children resulted from these unions. However, people in the 1840s did know how sex worked, and there were several forms of contraception available. Believers may try to say, looking at the ages of some of Joseph's affairs, I don't really want to solemnize some of his activities as calling them marriages. They were just really that, affairs. But they'll say that, well, people married earlier back then, and it wasn't unusual for girls to marry young, or that older men marrying young women wasn't looked down on in that era, Or even they'll say that, well, we can't judge based on our modern lens. Okay. But that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. According to census data from the 1820s through the 1840s, the average age for men to marry was 26 and a half, and for women, it was about 23. Now, it is true that about 10% of women in the 15 to 19-year-old range were married, but they were generally married to people a lot closer to their own age. It wasn't common for a 38-year-old man to marry 14 to 16-year-old girls, or even 19-year-old women. Okay, well, what did people at the time think of Joseph's advances on so many girls and women? Well, the first indication was how secret Joseph kept his extramarital relationships from others, including his first wife, Emma. Another is several instances when mobs of angry people attacked Joseph Smith. One such instance involved a mob of angry men, likely led by Eli Johnson, the brother of Miranda Johnson, who broke into Joseph's house in the middle of the night. They tarred and feathered him. They even brought a doctor with them, allegedly intending for him to castrate Joseph. Why would they do that? Well, apparently, it was because Joseph had become too intimate with Eli's sister, Miranda, whom he married in 1842. And there's, of course, the mob that stormed the jail that Joseph and his brother Hiram were held in and assassinated them for destroying the printing press that brought to light Joseph's polygamy. So I think it's pretty safe to say that people in the 1800s didn't take too kindly to men using their position of power and influence to take advantage of girls. Let me emphasize that again, girls and women. Now, our modern lens doesn't really seem all that different from a 19th century lens. But what are your thoughts on that? A believer may say that, well, women liked polygamy. Now, granted, I will give that I am sure that there were some that did. But the problem comes when a person uses unethical methods and manipulation to reach their goals. Joseph several times approached women and girls and told them that an angel with a flaming sword was threatening to kill him if he didn't agree to live the principle of plural marriage. 23-year-old Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner said that Joseph told her that an angel threatened to kill him if he didn't obey the principle of plural marriage. The problem is that she was the 8th plural wife of Joseph. She was also married to another man, and she had 2 children with him. What's even worse is that 9 other people reported this account of an angel with a drawn sword threatening Joseph. These include Eliza R. Snow, Helen Mar Kimball, and Zena Huntington. Now, this sounds pretty close to coercion. Joseph used other forms of coercion to convince other women and girls to marry him. This included putting them under a time crunch, or something like promising their family salvation, or on the other side of things, even threatening that the doors would be closed to them forever. It's easy to condemn the likes of Warren Jeffs, the leader of the FLDS Church, when he does similar things. But when the prophet of the Restoration does it, all of a sudden we try to look the other direction, or justify it as okay somehow. What's more is that until about 1900, plural marriage was considered essential for admittance into the highest level of heaven in Mormonism, the celestial kingdom. Now, if you are taught that a thing is essential to your exaltation, and for 2 or 3 generations you are taught that any other way is inferior, or dare I say counterfeit, then a person can convince themselves that they love it. They may defend it. But when we see the coercion and unethical behavior and manipulation that was associated with plural marriage, can we really defend it as being from God? Now, I am of course only scratching the surface. I haven't really addressed the human trafficking that occurred from Europe, bringing young women converts to Utah for the purpose of pressing them into plural marriages. But, they might say, polygamy was for the purpose of raising up seed. More children are born under polygamous relationships. This might seem to be true when seeing a man in the Utah era married to 56 wives, Brigham Young, having 57 children, again, Brigham Young. A chief contention in favor of polygamy is that it produced more children than would have been produced via monogamous relationships. However, in circles that study such things, the general consensus is that plural wives have fewer children than monogamous relationships. This is especially true for later wives. It is true that there were fewer single women in polygamous Utah, but it also concentrates more women into the homes of fewer men. The number of wives that a man holds, along with the number of children to that one man, becomes more of a status symbol. You are considered more righteous if you have multiple wives. And how well could a man effectively take care of 3, 4, or 50 wives? Are such relationships healthy? We just have to look to the FLDS to see the effects that polygamy would have had it continued until the modern day. Specifically, that women and girls become a commodity for righteousness for men. Polygamy as it was practiced in early Utah Mormonism was bad enough, but it wasn't even practiced the way it was outlined in Doctrine and Covenants section 132. A summary of this rather long revelation is that it declares that the new and everlasting covenant as polygamy. The modern church has redefined this instead as eternal monogamous marriage, solemnized in the temple. However, a clear reading of this section makes it clear that polygamy is the new and everlasting covenant. It warns that those who don't marry under the law of the covenant or who are single become servants for those who are married under the law of the covenant. It says that women are given and taken via revelation, and that the Lord condones David and Solomon's polygamy. Granted, this was after condemning it in the Book of Mormon. If a wife's husband commits adultery, Joseph has the power to take her and give her to another man. There are several threats leveled at Joseph's first wife, Emma, to destruction if she doesn't allow her husband to practice plural marriage. The women given in plural marriage are to be virgins, though Joseph didn't observe this as he took several currently married women as his plural wives. It also outlines the so-called Law of Sarah, which is that Emma is to consent before Joseph takes another plural wife. But if she won't consent, Joseph can take the plural wife anyway. Joseph established these rules of polygamy and then proceeded to break them continuously. These rules weren't used in later Utah-era polygamy. So the Lord, or Joseph, can't really tell which, wasn't even consistent in the practice. Joseph seemed to be kind of just making it up as he went along. Now, I am fine with polyamorous relationships as long as all of the people involved are old enough to consent and that there is no coercion involved. This is not what happened in the early church. The foundation of the church is based on terrible and abusive behavior. If someone says that they are comfortable with Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, I have to ask, are they comfortable with a man marrying children? Are they comfortable with church leaders, people that claim to speak for God, marrying children, vulnerable young women, and the wives of other men? If you are a believer, would you be comfortable with Joseph Smith being alone with your daughter? Would you give your underage daughter to him in marriage? Unfortunately, with how the leadership covers up abuse cases in the church with the assistance of local bishops and stake presidents, I think that they likely would be. Now, are you comfortable with a man marrying children? That is really the only question that needs to be asked in this context. But What are your thoughts? Is there anything I left out? Let me know down in the comments. And again, if you like what I do, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you again in the next video.